Good morning. Today's scripture reading comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verses 1 to 9, and it comes from the NRSV UE version. On the first day of the third month after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. They journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and they camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called him from the mountain. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on the eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. And now, if you will listen to my voice carefully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So Moses went, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words Yahweh had commanded him. The people all answered as one, everything Yahweh has spoken, we will do. Moses reported the words of the people to Yahweh. Then Yahweh said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after. This is the word of the Lord.
Hello, sorry. Good morning. Before I begin today, just want to convey a quick word of gratitude. As just shared, today is my last Sunday with you, and starting September, Dana and I will be moving on to some new things, so I just want to say to open today, thank you for the last 4 years. When Dana and I, back in 2020, were about to graduate, and COVID hit and life went sideways for a long time there. For a variety of reasons, we made the decision to come out to Richmond, Vancouver area. And since then, this place has been home in many ways, and peace has been a part of that. So we just want to express our gratitude to everyone here who has welcomed and been with us over the last 4 years. Thank you for your hospitality, for your food and your wonderful stories, and for your efforts towards making Peace Mennonite more than just a building. You know that in the era of the ever-expanding megachurch, that Peace, a relatively small family in the shadow of empires, has chosen and chooses to be a community here is no small feat. And for Dana and me to be a small part of that over the church's 4 decades, to be in the footsteps of names like Palmer and Jesse and others, it has been an honor. So thank you. A special note must also go out to those who were especially supportive when things didn't go exactly as planned last year with the partnership. So that was really tough, so thank you all for your steady support. And lastly, and most of all then, thanks to all the families and youth. Many of them aren't here today, they're in last-minute vacations, lucky them. But thanks to them who have made this role more than just a job. Our youth here are brilliant, and they are beloved, and it's been a joy to know every single one of them. As also noted, they aren't entirely rid of me yet, so they don't need to fret. They can hold on to those tears, those amazing words, and those massive cash donations a little longer still. So, should have seen them at the PNE the other day, just $10 for food. I was like, that was a lot of food, a lot of money. But anyway, with that, let us move on to our text and sermon this morning. Today we are, believe it or not, beginning to wind down our summer series. I don't know about you, but I can personally do 6 months of summer every year, so I'm sad to be hitting the end of August. What that means for us here then is there are 2 Sundays left after today in our summer favorites kind of series. We've heard messages the past couple of months from Amos, from 1 Kings and Jonah and others, and today we're in Exodus, so that's really exciting. We've had so much good stuff this past summer from what we call the Old Testament, and that is just fantastic. As you might have heard from me before, I am a huge fan of this so-called Old Testament. It's not that the new one isn't exciting, it's just that in our modern context, it sometimes feels like we love and talk about the new so much, but we don't always know what to do with the old. And that's really heartbreaking to me because they are both so vital. And I'm not sure we Christians have always done a great job exploring it. So it's always good news to me when we are in it. And I believe strongly exploring it is necessary and worthy. As mentioned, we are in Exodus, which is a super fun book. It really is. So let's do a quick prayer and then we will dive in. Lord, thank you for this morning that we can gather to hope for a word from you. In song, in liturgy, in text, and in conversation, may we be attentive to your voice today in a variety of ways, that we may better be the beloved community here and beyond. Amen. I remember growing up, my dad talked a lot about leadership. Whether it was work, or church, or sports, or other things, leadership as an idea was really important in my childhood household. Could have been because my dad often led in work, in church, in sports, and other things, but whatever the reason, as a result of that upbringing, my siblings and I always had ideas of leadership in the forefront of our hearts and minds. Just a few really cool kids, eh? But my dad really emphasized it to us, this idea that people can and people should influence or guide others across life's many arenas toward greater ends. Because of this then, especially when talking about church, from childhood I always knew it was really important to look to leaders, to look to those who are guiding, to respect those in positions of authority, and to pay attention to those who were serving the gathered people of God. Studying the Bible alongside this big concept of leadership, then as a youth, I was therefore also always fascinated with characters like Moses and David and Paul and of course Jesus as these iconic leaders in the pages of this book. I would always ask questions in their stories like, okay, but what are the lines of succession here? What does it mean to have authority here? Who in my community might be leading like this, and how might I potentially lead one day too? At its best, in my growing up years, emphasis on leadership in church meant really fruitful mentorship. It meant deeper community. It meant growth in all sorts of ways. At its worst, though, emphasis on leadership sometimes also meant overwhelming pressure, failure and shame and feelings around that, an unending struggle for clout, for control under the guise of godliness. Whatever the case, though, as a result of all this, for me in the first 2 decades of my life, leaders and leadership were always under the microscope. It was an omnipresent idea in my spirituality, informing so much of what I thought and did. Imagine my surprise then, one year in college, as I have told many times from up here before, when Anabaptism and Mennonites sprung to my attention for real for the first time in my life, and I learned actually there were and still are historic Christian communities that focus a lot less on leadership and much more on sharing influence, on communal discernment, less on authority and more on empowering one another, less on organizational charts and structures, and more on the priesthood of all in the community of God to speak and act by the Spirit. Imagine my surprise then as I learned more about this radical Reformation and the witness of Anabaptism over against Catholic and Protestant churches in that time that spent much of their time in that era with their rulers, with their princes, with their clergy, lording over one another the right to rule. Imagine my surprise then, discovering that though there were and are many deep, valuable truths from my upbringing in leadership and church, that not only was leadership not a prominent aspect of all Christian communities, in fact, actually, an overemphasis on leadership in Christianity might sometimes have opposite and unintentional effects of disempowering people, or worse, causing them to fight with one another for power, for control and status in God's name. The radical reformers, as I discovered in college, seemed to me to be onto something in their struggles with the established churches and governments of their times. A struggle that got many of them killed, unfortunately, and a struggle with themes that actually, when you think about it, echo far, far back, right into the pages of our scriptures, like the one we are in this morning. And this witnesses to a common endeavor of God's people, apparently across time and space. So my friends, today we are in Exodus 19, vital but ignored sometimes as a story between those iconic narratives, right? You've got Pharaoh and plagues and sea crossings, and then you've got Moses at Sinai and the giving of those famous 10 words. Exodus 19 as a story that takes place in between these two major episodes can be really easily glossed over. But today I want us to spend some time in it to ask, what might it say to us here and now? Between the chaos of liberation and delivery from the chains of death, and the fire, the stone, the lightning of the mountaintop, what might chapter 19 tell us in the middle about God, about God's people, and ultimately for us today, how must we live as a community following this same God? Well, there's a lot that can be said about Exodus 19, but today let's just focus on a couple things. First, as we begin today, I want us to be aware of the fragility of the moment of Exodus 19. This is a tumultuous time in ancient Israel's history. For if you know the story, you'll know Exodus 19 is about as delicate as there's ever been a time for people of Yahweh in the Bible. This moment is what I might call a seedling moment for any of you out there into plants, like maybe I am a little bit too much these days. You know that moment when you've prepped the soil, you've planted the seed, you've watered it, given it time, you've given it heat. Those first moments when the seedling just begins to poke out of the soil. If you've tried to plant things before, you'll know those beginning moments are about as fragile as it can get for a plant. This seedling time is unique because all who work with plants know that if a plant can get over the hump, if it can establish itself and survive past this little seedling stage and grow into a young plant, there is a significantly higher chance it'll be able to grow toward bigger and better days. For Israel in Exodus 19, this is a seedling moment. They had just gone through the most iconic event in their history. They had just survived the first real great empire of the Bible, and you know, spoiler alert, in the pages after, in the 37 subsequent books of the Old Testament, that everything that happens there happens as a result of what God does for ancient Israel here. This was the generation that experienced the moment of moments. And if you look at all the rest of the theohistorical writings, the poetry, the prophets, all of it frequently references back to this time here of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. It is a defining moment for their people. From Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the 12, to slavery, to peoplehood, with identity, with grounding, with belonging and hope, because Yahweh reached out with a mighty hand and outstretched arm to rescue this underdog from a big, bad empire. And as a result, Israel's redemption, their transformation, takes them from a bunch of slaves holding on to really old promises to a people with life and potential under their God once again. For Yahweh did not set his affection on Israel, choosing them because they were great, Deuteronomy tells us. For Israel was the least of all peoples, but it was because the Lord loved them, kept the oath sworn to their ancestors, that he brought them out and redeemed them from slavery, from the power of Pharaoh. Know therefore that Yahweh their God is a faithful God, keeping the covenant of love to 1,000 generations. So all this to say, I hope you understand the moment we're here in Exodus. Before we even dive into it today, Israel had just been through their defining moment as a people, and that defining moment would become the paradigm for what their God would then be known for again and again and again and again and again. A God that saves, a God that acts, a God that remembers, a God that promises, and a God that loves an underdog, not because they were great, but because of faithfulness and covenantal love. My friends, maybe you have had moments like this in your life where you've just been through hell, maybe with your job, maybe the loss of a loved one, a scary diagnosis, a crushing and overwhelming economic system that values not life and connection, but production and consumption. Can you maybe also remember then a moment of great delivery, of transformative news, of the possibility for new life, of a break so great it allowed you to get back on your feet again? Those tender moments right after, where you know you have just experienced something you know you are going to look back on for the rest of your life. Nothing matches up to these moments. There are almost no words to describe them. In Exodus 19, ancient Israel had been through something of this sort, except not just as individuals, but as a community. And now here they were, a seedling on the cusp of something new, to be established in a scary world where they were but a small vine in a big, big forest. And so when we get into Exodus 19, that should make us think deeply, as once again we hear it as it says, "On the first day of the 3rd month after Israel had gone out from Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. They journeyed, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up, and God called to him from the mountains, 'Moses, say this to the children of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And now, if you will listen to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be for me a treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom, a holy nation.'" The second thing I want us to home in on today is the latter half of these verses, what Yahweh says to ancient Israel through Moses. For this is one of the major points of a thread that started in Genesis, but that will continue on and on and on throughout the entire Bible as one of the great themes of the whole book. That God acts in power to bring people in. Out of obscurity, out of empire, out of death, God calls and draws people near. And as a result, people are established where there was none before, tasked with living out and sharing that peoplehood, that all may know God and God's power to bring life and love and goodness to all. This is a timeless witness of our scriptures, that the God of these stories saves not by floating souls off into the sky when they die, but by transforming the real circumstances of people on earth to inaugurate a heaven here. And as a result, people who have experienced this transformation are to partake in that reality of heaven on earth by living out a version of it now. Last week we heard from Hebrews 4, this idea that Jesus is the great high priest who allows us to approach God with confidence, and that's powerful. But let us not forget also then how this idea of priesthood actually has so many layers across our scriptures. For we see even here in this story set 55 books before Hebrews already. There is an ask, there is an ability, there is a responsibility of God's people to mediate on earth in some way the presence of God. There is a consistent thread and theme across the entire Bible that God's people can help do what is ultimately most powerfully done by Jesus, making real the God-human connection. And my friends, I hope we understand how incredible that is. For this idea of priesthood, of helping connect God and people, is radical. And it has indeed caused many in history, as it should for us today, to reflect and ask, what does it mean that people who want to follow this same God might live as priests? 400 to 500 years ago, the early Anabaptists look around as they held their scriptures, and they ask, what does it mean for us that God gathers people from obscurity and then asks them to respond? How does that compare to what's going on all around us right now in Europe, where the married church and state together assert they define belonging, they define faith? How does allegiance to Jesus empower all of us here who seek and receive him to live out the priesthood, not relying on the acts and mechanisms of people alone, but on God? In 1 Peter 2, the apostle writes to a scattered group, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, that you may declare the praises of God who called you out of darkness and into wonderful light." Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. For the early Anabaptists, they took verses like 1 Peter, maybe here like Exodus, and they connected the dots. They drew the lines to the logical ends for their time. Within a culture where the church had become heavily institutionalized alongside governments, to colonize, to war, to profit, where corruption was rampant, where abuse was common, where the gaps between the rich and the poor were massive, where baptism into state and church had become so conflated they were the same thing. The pinnacle of a Christian nationalism that had been in some form for thousands of years. Against all of that, the Anabaptists witness to the truth that God draws near to and empowers everyday people who choose to choose him back to do the good work of drawing even more near into love and shalom, an expansion of election in the pattern of God's heart for all. Today, for us, here as Mennonites in the 21st century, how much of this is still at play? I look around and see how we live in a post-Christian culture in the West, where many know of an idea of church and they struggle with it, largely because of its heavy and historic institutionalization alongside governments, to expand, to war, to profit, to shame, to abuse, and live into some pretense of morality. We see it all around us even today. Certain political parties love to brand themselves the Christian party. So it is within this culture that we find ourselves still like our ancestors. Just a seedling in a big, messy forest. In my 4 years, I have been asked a lot, where are the people? How do we how do we help them come back? And I'll be honest with you, if you're asking me this from the perspective of wanting this institution to survive for its own sake or because of what once was, honestly, I'm sorry, that's not that interesting of a question for me. Even if I were interested, I still have bad news for you, unfortunately. All throughout history, churches have come and gone, good and bad ones. That's how it goes. It's a myth of modernity to believe in perpetual growth and forever progress. Churches, in many times and places, naturally come and go. They rise and fall. as Anabaptists, as Mennonites, we should definitely know that based on our history. In our times, already in many ways, people have already spoken how they feel. They have left, or they are in the process of leaving, because they know the institution, without a deep and true belonging, without a deep and true shared way of life, ultimately doesn't mean that much. 4 songs and a sermon each week, if that's what we are here for their own sake, I don't know. But if you're asking me that question of church, from the perspective not of institutional continuation, but because you genuinely want to see and partake in the work of God in all areas of life, in and outside the church, beyond traditional bounds, that's a question I'm very interested in. That's an idea I want to explore because it is church grounded not in existence for its own sake, or for nostalgia, or for budgets and policies, not that those things are not important, but church grounded in greater things for all people who live in this place through the same God who here in Exodus draws people in and then sends them out. If we are bold in believing God works through everyday people in all realms of life, no matter the status of the institution, then I have good news for you today. Our God is still working. So peoplehood, community, life are still possible, no matter what the institution looks like. As Mennonites, as those in the lineage of the Anabaptists, there shouldn't be many more traditions apart from us, or there shouldn't be traditions who know better than us, I should say, what it is like to have to start over again, on the run, on the fly. And there shouldn't be many other traditions who know better than us what it means then to live as the priesthood wherever we are. For we are not a tradition of scholars, of clerics, of qualified professionals. We've rarely ever even been established. No, we are the ones in the tradition of those who have said, any called and empowered can and should lead in the church and be the church wherever it is. And it should not be solely for those with big buildings and big budgets and highfalutin theologies. In an evolving world with the crushing weight of our multifaceted intersecting systems where Reverend Melissa Floor-Bixler says capitalism is killing the small church, Reverend Floor-Bixler also says the richness of the small church comes through relationship, where we belong to one another because we have come to discover every person is needed, not just the pastors and the theologians. Today, as I reflect on Exodus 19, I am stirred to think of how in BC right now, if we look to the continuation of Christian institutions as our future, it's probably bleak. Organizations simply come and go. And I'm just not sure we can compete with the Willingdons, with the villages, with the tents, nothing against them. But if instead we look to the ongoing creation of everyday community in all its forms and blessings for all people as response to the work of God, then every day and everywhere is opportunity to share in the good news that all are beloved and all can find liberation from empire in all its forms, across race, across gender, across sexuality, across class and tradition and wealth and ability and background. As Mennonites, we should know this well, as a people who have always operated outside the norm and a prophetic witness against domineering institutions. It is our calling and our responsibility now to hear the voice of God and to work out the meaning of the priesthood of all believers for this time and place. Whether or not peace lasts another 40 years, I am less invested in that than I am in the idea that regardless of the state of this organization and Christian institutions in general, that people here, regardless in their everyday life in all areas, wake up every day and ask, how can I do little acts of priesthood today? What is shalom here? How do I live it out? Where is God leading in work, in life, and play? That to me is so much more interesting. At the end of the day, I think both my dad and the Anabaptists were onto something in their messages to me. Whatever is next for peace, it's going to take leadership. But leadership is not just going to come from the people you pay. It's got to come from each and every person here according to your gift and your calling, and it's got to take place in every area of life, within these walls and absolutely beyond them, as response to a God that has not stopped working to gather people since the very stories of these pages. If peace carves a future for itself, may it be because the priesthood here knew God's love and shared God's love in all its forms with all people everywhere. So may God bless and keep you in all your endeavors centered upon the good work. Thank you.